what was going on here? He was objecting that the Christians were trying to change his point of view by saying that he was wrong and he should adopt their view. And what was his response? No, the other is true. You Christians are wrong in following the Great Commission of your Savior, and you ought to adopt my religious view about evangelism. The fact is, he was doing exactly the same thing that he was complaining the Christians ought not do. I had a student come to me once who was going to university kind of like this, and she said, I talked to my anthropology professor. My anthropology professor was very supportive of me in my Christianity. And then I told her that I was really interested in becoming a missionary. And that upset my professor a lot. And she said to me, you know, it's wrong for you to try to go out and change other people's religious views. And so she came to me, or she might have called me on the radio, and she said, how do I respond to that? I said, you go back to your professor and you ask the professor this question. Maybe some of you have already thought of this. Are you trying to what? Change my religious views. You see, the professor was again doing the very thing that she was telling the student not to do. What does this demonstrate? That the professor's wrong? No. That the rabbis are wrong? No. The point is they're not neutral. It doesn't matter what side theologically you come down on, whether you believe that the Jewish view of the world is correct or the Christian view. That's not my point. My point is everybody's got a point of view, and they think they're right, and they're arguing for that, but one group largely is posturing as if they're neutral, and they're not. When it comes to the moral questions, there is no place of genuine neutrality except for silence. You want to be really neutral, morally speaking, if you are really a moral relativist, the only thing that you have at your disposal that is consistent with moral neutrality is silence. The minute you open your mouth in the face of any egregious moral wrong and make a moral recommendation, you have violated your neutrality, you have taken a moral position, and you have affirmed the existence of moral absolutes at that point. Unless, of course, you're very careful to say, but this is just my personal preference. My preference is that that's wrong, but I'm not condemning you. And then the question can be raised, then why are you talking at all? If this is just your preference, why should I care whether you like broccoli or Brussels sprouts? It's irrelevant, right? But hidden in there is the kind of the assumption that you have a moral obligation to care about what I care about. So the morality is smuggled in the back door there. No, if we are going to be consistent relativists, then we can't make any moral judgments whatsoever. And a lot of folks are very inconsistent here. They don't want moral judgments against them, but they want moral judgments in favor of them. Do you know that good is moral judgment as well? I'm really looking forward to the time when somebody who I've had a discussion with about moral relativism comes up to me and says, you know, after they've made their case against morality or objective morality, and then they said, you know, I saw what you did over to that person as you're talking to that person who's really having a hard time. That was really good of you to do that. And then I could say, how dare you push your morality on me? Because good is a moral judgment just like bad is. And if there are no morals that are objective in any sense, then the word good is just as meaningless as the word bad. Let me give you one other illustration to point out this problem with moral neutrality. My kid was raised, my brother's kids were raised in Florida. I'm sorry, he's in Florida now, but he was in Maui in Hawaii. And when they were in 3rd and 4th grade, they went through these exercises called values clarification. This is the idea where problems are given to the children, and they're expected to work them out. They're moral problems, and they're expected to work them out on their own and come to their own conclusions, clarify their own values. Now, they're not given any guidelines. They're not given any directions here. They're just given the problem. And I think the one that my nephew and niece had to deal with was a man who had killed his wife, who was aging and ill and suffering, and so it was a euthanasia kind of thing, a mercy killing. And they were asked, gee, under these circumstances, should we punish this poor old man who took his wife's life under these circumstances? And so even the illustrations, I think, are a little bit abusive and suggestive of an answer. But in any event, they don't give any outward directives. My brother found out about what was going on in the classroom. He got real upset. He came to the class, and he talked later on afterwards to the teacher. The teacher was quite defensive. He said, I don't understand why you're upset, because we are not pushing our morality on them. We are telling them it's up to them. We're not telling them what to do. We're not giving them any guidelines. It's completely their decision. We're neutral, was the claim. And my brother, it was a great observation. He said, you know, when you give my children difficult moral problems to solve, some of the most difficult that anybody has to deal with, and then you tell them, by the way, there are no moral rules to guide you. There are no absolutes that will help you out in this. There are no directives that will give you answers in these circumstances, but it's simply up to you. Well, that's not neutral. That is the aggressive promotion of a particular point of view called moral relativism. Now, that deals with, I think, to a great degree, this problem of apparent neutrality, which there isn't any, and the tolerance that's attached to it. Because the challenge of intolerance is also itself a moral challenge. It's a claim that some moral thing is true, that is, the rule that you ought to tolerate, whatever that means, and the meaning of that has shifted over the years, to almost mean the opposite now is what it used to mean, by the way. But it still carries in the minds of many people the same moral imperative. So that if you're intolerant, you've done something what? Wrong. And wrong is a moral term. And if you're a relativist, then you can't have any kind of thing wrong. Now, I'd like to give you a handful of flaws in relativism. Before I do that, though, I want to clarify something here about the whole issue, because I keep using this term moral to describe relativism. We call it moral relativism. The reason I do that is because that is the terminology in the field, as it were, to describe it. But I don't want you to misunderstand the nature of moral relativism as if it is a moral alternative, that is an alternative way of thinking morally about moral rules, because it turns out that relativism is not a refinement of how we understand morality. It is a denial of how we understand morality. And I'm going to give you a very simple illustration to show how this is true. You can judge the validity of a moral principle by looking at the principle in action, as it were. Finding the person who is the best exemplar of that principle, who is something like the hero of the principle, who lives it out to something like perfection, and by gazing at the individual themselves, you can, in the presence of virtue, if it's there, commends the moral principle that helped this person to become that way. For example, if your moral principle is you should always help other people in need at all times and take no thought for your own needs. Well, what does a person look like who lives that out to something like perfection? Well, you live like that and it produces a Mother Teresa. You behold a Mother Teresa and you can see the obvious virtue in her life. And as a result, you think that must be a pretty good moral rule that produces this kind of individual. Or you could say that whenever you have to resist the government, you do so with nonviolent passive resistance. And that living that out to some kind of perfection, the moral hero of that view might be a Gandhi or Dr. Martin Luther King. If your moral view is you should always obey the Father in heaven in everything that you do, you see a person who lives this out to perfection, it produces a Jesus Christ. And you say, Jesus Christ, moral rule. It must be a pretty good moral rule that produces this kind of human being. Okay, that's our motif. How does that apply to relativism? So my question is, what is the champion of relativism? What is the hero of relativism? What is the kind of person that lives according to the dictates of relativism most consistently? Now, we have a word for that kind of person in the English language, a person who has no concern for other people's idea of right and wrong, who follows his or her own views of right and wrong, and marches most consistently to the beat of their own moral drum. It's a homicide detective's worst nightmare. It's a person without a conscience, sociopath. Now, friends, there's got to be something wrong with an appropriate, with a possible or a offered point of view, moral point of view of relativism, that it produces as its logical result, as its purpose, not as a wild spin-off, not as like, well, everybody gets a little strange one now, but this is the goal. It produces a sociopath. And this is why we don't teach relativism to our kids. We like it for ourselves, but we don't teach our kids that. And this is why relativism has been rejected by every single moral leader in the history of the world that stood head or shoulders above anyone else. You take whoever you want. You can take Moses, you can take Krishna, you can take Buddha, you take Jesus Christ, you can take the Apostle Paul, you can take Aristotle, you can take Martin Luther King. Whoever stood head and shoulders above them all condemned this as immoral. The person who's a relativist has no morality, period. Now, I know this is offensive to some people. They say, well, they don't like someone taking the moral label away from them. And they'll say things, how dare you say that? I have my morality. I do whatever's right for me. That's my morality. That's my point. Because morality isn't doing whatever's right for you. Morality is doing what's right, trying to figure out what's right and then doing it. That's morality. Okay, now this kind of introduces us to this whole concept and to the problem with moral neutrality and the problem with tolerance and even the problem with calling relativism moral, because it's a denial of morality, not a version of morality. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 what I consider fatal flaws